Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Fernandez, and I am from the Department of Programs and Partnerships here at Arlington Public Library. Thank you all so much for joining us today to hear Michael Kazin discuss his book, War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 to 1918. A special thanks to the Friends of the Arlington Public Library, whose incredible generosity funds all of our library programming, including bringing fantastic speakers like the one we are about to see. Mr. Kazin's appearance is part of an ongoing library-wide commemoration of the centennial of World War I, of which 2018 is the final year. Join us in March for a reading of World War I poetry here in Central Library Auditorium, featuring Arlington Poet Laureate Catherine E. Young. There are flyers outside. And as always, you can visit us online at library.arlingtonva.us and follow us on social media for the most current listing of upcoming library programs. Michael Kazin is a professor of history at Georgetown University and editor of Dissent magazine. An expert on the history of social movements in the United States, Mr. Kazin's previous books include American Dreamers, How the Left Changed a Nation, A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan, America Divided, The Civil War of the 1960s, which he co-authored with Maurice Iserman, The Populist Persuasion in American History, and Barons of Labor, the San Francisco Building Trades and Union Power in the Progressive Era, which was named one of the best books of 2000 by the Washington Post. In addition, Mr. Kazin is editor-in-chief of the Princeton Encyclopedia of American Political History, co-editor of the anthology Americanism, and editor of In Search of Progressive America. Mr. Kazin has contributed to The Washington Post, The Nation, Democracy, The New York Times Book Review, Foreign Affairs, among many other publications and websites. Lastly, we would like to thank our partners from Barnes & Noble, who will have copies of the book both in hardcover and the newly released paperback for sale. Additionally, War Against War is in the library catalog in both hardcover and downloadable audiobook formats, so if you have not yet read it, you can also request it with your library card. There will be time after the talk for a question and answer session and to have your book signed. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael Kazin.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Thanks to the Friends of the Library. We should, keep libraries going as long as possible. I'm always afraid in this cyber world that somehow we'll be reading on our own, in our homes, or on the street somewhere and not go to libraries, and that would be a real shame. This is a talk about my book, which is a book about the Americans who opposed World War I, why they opposed it, what they did to oppose it, what happened to them, why they lost. But of course, I'm more than willing to talk about the history of the war more generally. I will make passing reference to it in my talk, but it was a very big war, the Great War, as it was called at the time, and in 40 minutes or so, I can hardly handle everything. So feel free, please, to ask any questions you'd like to about the war more generally, especially the U.S. part of the war, which I know a lot more about than I do, say, the Ottoman Empire's part in the war. I want to start, where's my clicker? I want to start by showing you photos of 4 of the leaders of this movement against the war, which is really a coalition between people in Congress and people outside Congress, who at first tried to stop the United States from preparing to fight in the war by enlarging the American military, especially the US Army, so it would be the size of the belligerent powers fighting the war in Europe. And then once the US declares war, April 6, 1917, they also continued under great duress, government persecution in many cases, to continue to oppose the war. At least many of them did. I want to start by showing you photos of 4 of the leaders of this coalition, which in many ways I think was the largest and most sophisticated opposition to any war in US history until the Vietnam War 50 years later. And few Americans, I think, could recognize any of these figures today. I'm curious how many of you know them. If you know all of them, then just buy my book and you can leave. But I'm just curious, so I will ask you, how many people have heard of this guy? Most of you, okay. He's the best known of the 4 figures. La Follette was a leader of progressive Republicans. He was from Wisconsin. He was And this is a time, by the way, as many of you know, when both political parties had lefts and rights within them. There were conservative Republicans, there were conservative Democrats, there were more progressive Democrats, and more progressive Republicans, unlike now, when we're very polarized ideologically between the two parties. He was a leader of Midwestern Republicans from the Great Plains and from the upper Midwest, an important faction in his party, opposing preparing for war and then going to war. How many people have heard of Crystal Eastman? Aha, one figure back there. Crystal Eastman should be better known, as should all these figures, I think. She was a sort of organizer extraordinaire. She was an active suffragist, an active feminist. She was a lawyer and a sociologist who wrote one of the first, most authoritative books about industrial accidents in America in 1910 as part of a larger project called the Pittsburgh Survey, where she found that 1,000 workers every year, almost all of them male, died in industrial accidents in Pittsburgh alone. No one ever counted how many people had died in industrial accidents before. But her major cause from 1915 on was organizing two of the largest and new institutions of the anti-war coalition. One, the American Union Against Militarism, which she was the leading organizer in, and the other one, the Women's Peace Party, which she was the head of the New York contingent, the large contingent of that peace party. Jane Addams, the great social reformer, was the president of the Peace Party altogether. How about this guy? Morris Hillquit. Okay. One person. Usually I get to know anybody who knows him. Morris Hillquit was one of the leaders of the Socialist Party of America at a time when the Socialist Party was as strong as it's ever been in American history, had about 120,000 members at its height around this time. He was born in Latvia. He was an immigrant from the Tsarist Empire. His first language was German. His second language was Russian. His third language was English, and he learned Yiddish, the language of most Jewish immigrants, which he was one of when he came to the United States because he wanted to communicate with the people he worked for. He was a labor lawyer for the garment workers unions, but for this coalition, he was most important as the man who wrote most of the statements the Socialist Party put out opposing the war. He also ran in 1917, in the fall of 1917, 6 months after the U.S. had entered World War I, for mayor of New York City on an explicitly anti-war platform at a time when he could have gotten arrested for opposing the war on the Espionage Act. It didn't bother him, and he got 22% of the vote. Came in third, but it's quite remarkable that 6 months after the U.S. entered World War I, an explicitly socialist, anti-war, anti-draft candidate could win almost a quarter of the vote. In fact, the Wilson administration was so afraid that he might actually get elected to the mayoralty of New York City, the biggest city in the country, of course, one of the two biggest cities in the world at the time, that they thought about prosecuting him under the Espionage Act, but they decided that would make him into too much of a martyr, so they decided not to. Finally, Claude Kitchin. Anybody heard of him? Okay. There's a World War I Centennial guy up back there, so.
I got North Carolina roots.
Okay, great. Which district did he come from? The 2nd District, North Carolina. Claude Kitchin was a leader of Southern Democrats in Congress. He was the majority leader of Congress. He was also the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, which, as most of you know, being in the Washington orbit here, is a tax writing committee. So he was in charge of actually, raising revenue in effect, or at least proposing the bills which would raise revenue. He was the House Majority Leader for the whole period of the war. But he opposed the war, and he ended up being one of the 50 Congress people who actually voted against going to war, a war that the president of his own party, Woodrow Wilson, asked Congress to declare. So it's rather remarkable. It's hard to imagine that happening today. One of the leaders of the president's party, and the president asked for a declaration of war, opposing him. Of course, presidents don't ask for declarations of war anymore. So. But they did then. So these are 4 leaders, 2 in Congress, 1 leader of anti-war Republicans, 1 leader of anti-war Democrats, and 2 organizers, one of women and more liberal anti-war figures, Crystal Eastman, and more labor-oriented and socialist anti-war figures. That is Morris Silkworth. One misconception about those who opposed U.S. going to war is that they were isolationists. I'm sure you've heard that before. The only reason Americans opposed going to war is they were safe behind their oceans. The Germans were not going to be able to, send airplanes, their very primitive airplanes over here. They had submarines, but those submarines were not going to be able to attack, much beyond the coast of the United States, and unlikely they were going to be able to make it across the ocean to do that either. So that's why most Americans opposed the war. Now, that's true for certainly many ordinary Americans who were not part of a coalition, who were not activists opposing going to war, but it was not true of any of these figures I mentioned before. All of them, especially the first three, La Follette and Eastman and Hillquit, worked very hard to make and retain international connections. They wanted the United States to be deeply engaged in building a world order based on a more progressive democracy, based on peaceful, cooperative relationships between national states. Another misconception, too, is that, well, most Americans opposed the war, but nobody really supported going to war until very near the time when the U.S. declared war. That's also a misconception. There was a well-financed, well-organized, and fairly large pro-war coalition, as much as there was a well-organized and not as well-financed anti-war coalition. Some of the members of that coalition were here watching a military parade, and in the center there, you probably recognize, he liked to be known as Colonel Theodore Roosevelt at this time, but of course he was still a very popular ex-president of the United States. And he was in favor of building up the military. He was in favor of universal military training for all young men, whether or not they were going to go in the Army or not. He thought they should be ready to go in the Army if the government felt it necessary to do so. So there was a very active conflict, in other words, in the United States from 1914 to 1917 about whether the U.S. should go to war or not. And then after the U.S. does go to war, of course, Theodore Roosevelt's one of its biggest cheerleaders. In fact, he even wants to go to France to command his own regiment, as he did in the war against Spain in 1898, where he did lead the famous Rough Riders in Cuba. But Woodrow Wilson, who was a great rival of his, and the men didn't like each other at all, decided that wasn't going to happen. Roosevelt was in his late 50s, and Wilson made sure that Roosevelt was not able to become famous yet again by leading a regiment in the Great War. Well, at first, when the Great War began in August 1914, all Americans pretty much, including Theodore Roosevelt, opposed the United States being part of it. Woodrow Wilson gave this speech in the middle of August 1914, arguing that Americans have to be impartial in thought as well as action. You can read the rest. If not, he said, the one great nation still at peace, the United States, would not be able to mediate the conflict if the United States became involved in the war. So I think, and there's a lot of debate about this among historians, how actually sincere Wilson was in his neutral feelings. But certainly the United States was a neutral nation officially until April 6, 1917, almost 3 years after the war began. However, and this is my point of view and not the point of view of all historians, one of the things historians do is debate about the meaning of history. We sometimes debate about facts, but we certainly debate about the meaning of those facts. My opinion is that Wilson, in many ways, was never truly neutral. Why? Because early in 1915, Wilson decided to allow American business to trade with the Allied powers, the Triple Entente, as they're known at the time, especially Britain and France, also Russia at the time, but Russia was hard to trade with. It was hard to get goods through the continent at wartime. So he did nothing to compel American business to stay neutral. By early 1915, J.P. Morgan and Company, one of the largest investment houses in the country, had become the purchasing agent for the Allies. making 1% commission on everything, especially the British, bought from American companies. That material was bought through J.P. Morgan and Company. American food, American steel were keeping the British war effort going. And all that aid, not coincidentally, helped lift the United States out of a serious recession. So Wilson's choice to threaten war over just one side's violation of neutral rights, which was Germany's U-boat warfare, which was certainly a great risk to shipping on the Atlantic, and not the other side's, that is Britain's naval blockade of Germany, which killed, most historians argue, about 500,000 Germans, mostly older people and children, dying of hunger, dying of disease. That had a fateful consequence. The British Navy was superior on the North Atlantic, and so the Germans felt, perhaps regrettably but not surprisingly, that unleashing their U-boats on shipping going to the Allied powers, including American shipping, was the only military response they could make, the only way they could neutralize, if you will, or equalize the threat from the Royal Navy against them. So it was only a matter of time, I think, before those U-boat attacks provoked the United States into declaring war. Now, to give Wilson's due, his choice to protest the U-boats and not to protest the British blockade of Germany was not an irrational one. The North Atlantic, unlike the North Sea, which the British were blockading, was a lifeline for U.S. commerce. To destroy neutral ships, to kill neutral Americans, was a violation of existing international law. Even though the British blockade could have been interpreted as violating international law as well. There was a skeptical saying at the time, which many newspapers printed about the British blockade. It says, "Britannia rules the waves and waves the rules." But also, the president had emotional reasons for, I think, siding with the British. He didn't want the United States to enter the war until early 1917, but he also did not want the Germans to win. So he had to be careful what he did and what he said. And also, he was a lifelong Anglophile, was the president. Wilson's mother had been born in Britain. His greatest political heroes were the great political theorists and politicians, Edmund Burke and William Gladstone. And the Lake District in England was his favorite place on earth. Less than a month after Europeans went to war, in the fall of 1914, Wilson told his closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, that a German victory, quote, will change the course of our civilization and make the United States a militarist nation. So he wanted both the warring powers on both sides to make what he later called a peace without victory, but he really couldn't choose not to care who won the war. And in the end, the American decision to intervene played a critical role in the Allies winning. And what turned the tide here was not the actual fighting U.S. troops did, most of which took place in the final 6 months of the conflict. It was the fact that there were 2 million American doughboys, as they were called, draftees and enlisted men, who were coming to France by the summer of 1917. There were 2 million more who were being trained in training camps in the United States. And so the Germans decided, after fighting for 3 years, 4 years by that point, almost, that they could not withstand that. They could not defeat that. So the Germans in the spring of 1918 put all they had into a series of final offensives in France and Belgium. Those offensives got about 40 kilometers away from Paris, but they failed, and when they failed, that was all the Germans had. And German commanders made very clear that they were doing this because they would not have been able to defeat all these fresh, gung-ho American troops with the depleted forces that they had. One of the 2 major German commanders, a guy named General Erich Ludendorff, put it this way when he started what became the final German offensives in 1918. Ludendorff said, "We must strike before America can throw strong forces into the scales." Majority of American soldiers died in one battle in World War I. A long battle, the Meuse-Argonne, in eastern France, which began in September 1917 and only ended on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918. Excuse me, should have said 1918. As I said, we historians usually agree on the facts, but sometimes we also get them wrong on our slides. Now, let me turn to the people I wrote about after that background. The beginning of the anti-war movement / coalition was a feminist enterprise. The first anti-war march during the war took place at the end of August 1914, less than a month after the war had begun in Europe. 1,500 women strode down Fifth Avenue in New York. There were spectators, at least 10 times that many, on either side of the Broad Avenue in Manhattan. And no men were allowed to march. Compare that perhaps with the Women's March almost a year ago, January 21st, 2017, in which, of course, men and women marched as well in their protest against the incoming Trump administration. But here it was a women's march because the idea was that women are the gender, they would have said sex at the time, who get nothing from war. Men become heroes, men establish themselves, they become politicians after they've shown their mettle in combat, but women get nothing from war. They lose their children, they lose their husbands, they lose their uncles, and they have to hold up the home front while the men are doing the fighting. And this was very simple, very clear, very forceful anti-war message that these women put forth. The leader, the main organizer of the Women's March in 1914 was this woman, Fanny Garrison Villard. This is a photo a few years earlier. And those who know some American history, her middle name, actually her maiden name, might sound a little familiar. Any guesses who her father was? William Lloyd Garrison, of course, the great abolitionist, who, by the way, was a pacifist until the Civil War began. She said to a newspaper reporter that what this Women's March was only a feeble effort. We have simply cast a pebble into the water. I hope there may be ever-widening circles that perhaps will make men realize what a crime it is to send thousands of husbands and fathers and sons to a useless slaughter. Well, the circles did widen, and fairly quickly. By February 1915, a conference of 3,000 women met at the Willard Hotel, right next to the White House, downtown D.C., to found the Women's Peace Party, which was the largest women's organization in America at the time. Well, one of them. The largest was the Women's Suffrage Association, but besides that, it was the largest women's organization. Had about 40,000 members altogether. The delegates included every important feminist in the country and social reformer. And in a couple months later, the leaders of that party, including Jane Addams, who is second from the left there, went to The Hague, the capital of neutral Netherlands, to lead a women's peace conference to try to get the neutral nations in Europe, of which there are several, Scandinavia and the Netherlands especially, to try to put together a peace plan that the belligerent nations would have to accept. That was the idea, at least. And the power of this message, of the feminist message against war, can be, I think, demonstrated by the fact that the #1 song in America in 1915 was this one. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. Now, how do we know this is the #1 song in America? There was no Billboard magazine. There was no Spotify, Pandora, whatever the ways we count sales these days. Anybody know? A guess?
Sheet music.
Sheet music, exactly. This sold 800,000 copies of the sheet music in 1915. In fact, it was so popular that there were pro-war songs that were written in answer to it. You know, but I'm proud that my boy is a soldier, in effect. Well, go through quickly some of the growth of the movement, because I want to get to why they opposed the war. The American Union Against Militarism was formed a few months after that, in late 1915. These are two really important reformers of that day. Lillian Wald, who set up a settlement house in New York City, much like the Settlement House Hull House that Jane Addams set up in Chicago, Paul Kellogg, who was the editor of the most widely read, most influential magazine of social reform in America at the time, The Survey. Labor was well represented in the anti-war movement. Not Samuel Gompers, who was the president of the American Federation of Labor. He was born in Britain, and he, even though he'd been opposed to the war, opposed to all wars before 1914, once the war began, he thought the United States would eventually get into it, and labor would get something out of it by being a more legitimate force if it supported the war. But the radical union organization, Industrial Workers of the World, completely opposed it, and many major unions in the country opposed preparing for war. United Mine Workers Union, the Carpenters Union, and many others. As the movement blossomed, it attracted powerful allies in Congress, like the ones I mentioned before, for both major parties. One of the most powerful leaders who was not in Congress, but had been and had run for president 3 times, was this guy, who I wrote a biography about, William Jennings Bryan, Democratic nominee, not just once or twice, but 3 times, losing all 3 times. When I was writing my biography of Bryan, my kids said, you know, I understand why you wanted to write about somebody who lost, you know, it's kind of interesting, but why did you have to write about someone who lost 3 times? Anyway, but Bryan was the most popular figure in his party, the Democratic Party, except for President Woodrow Wilson. And he was especially popular in Congress. A lot of people who had been Bryanites before they were Wilsonians, if you will. And Claude Kitchen and he were very close, especially. And also there was a lot of ethnic opposition to the war. I can only give you a very superficial sense of that, or a quick one. Irish Americans, many of them were opposed to preparing to go to war because they didn't want to help the British Empire, which of course Ireland was still a part of the British Empire. Many Russians, especially Russian Jews, didn't want to go to war to support the Tsar of Russia, who was still in power until March of 1917. And many Italians supported their country in the war, but also were not really clear about what the United States would get out of it. So this is just an example of a mass meeting, war against war, not where I got the title of my book from, but that phrase was used all the time to describe the people I wrote about. And you see, this is in Lower Manhattan, all the languages that are spoken by the speakers at this meeting. And meetings like this were taking place all over the country, especially in big cities like New York. And a rather unlikely, perhaps, member of this anti-war coalition was the most famous industrialist, not just in the United States, but in the world, Henry Ford, the creator of the assembly line, of the Model T, the first car, as many of you know, that ordinary Americans could actually afford, which was made on the assembly line in his plant in Highland Park, Michigan. Ford was so much opposed to going to war that he decided to do something about it. So in December 1915, he chartered a ship, a Norwegian ship, to take pacifists, anti-war figures, and a lot of journalists along with him to go to Europe. They landed in Oslo, then called Christiania, the capital of Norway. And they hoped to do the same thing that Jane Addams and her sisters tried to do a few months earlier, which is to set up a conference of neutrals to mediate the war. Of course, it didn't happen, and he was made fun of. He said, for example, in early December 1915, we're going to charter the ship, and we'll get the boys out of the trenches by Christmas. 3 weeks later. Unlikely. And so people talked about Ford's folly, and there were cartoons. I have one in my book showing this ship with Ford on it and a huge snowball on the ship as the ship went into the hell of the combat, the maelstrom of bloodshed in Europe. But it gives you a sense of how powerfully and how, with the breadth of this movement, that this anti-union, powerful, wealthy industrialist, very famous all over the world, not just the United States, could be in the same coalition with socialists and feminists and union leaders. What motivated all these people? Well, they disagreed about a lot of domestic issues, it must be said. Claude Kitchen was in favor of prohibition of alcohol, for example. The other 3 I mentioned were not. He was not crazy about unions. He was a racist. He was opposed to black people being able to exercise the right to vote. The other three were anti-racist. But they agreed that the war in Europe was a disaster. It was something that the United States had no interest in fighting. All of them, in one way or another, were considered at the time to be pacifist. Now, pacifism did not mean then what it means now. Now, pacifism means you don't want to use force for anything, right? For policing, even. That's not what it meant then. What pacifism meant then was you think that wars are irrational and you would like them to be mediated or arbitrated by impartial authorities. That's what it meant at the time. And they all, in that sense, were pacifists. And Ford was perhaps one of the most radical pacifists of all, at least at the time. He said, quote, "To my mind, the word murderer should be embroidered in red letters across the breast of every soldier." Imagine Bill Gates saying that today, or any of the more famous, Mark Zuckerberg saying that today. But there was so much opposition to going to war, so much anti-militarism in America that he got away with it, was even praised for it at the time. So two major arguments were used by those who opposed going to war. First was quite a radical argument, and I mentioned it before. They said, how can we build a peaceful, more democratic, more harmonious world if the United States joins the worst war in history? How can you, as Crystal Eastman said, prepare for war and also for peace at the same time? Arming America, they feared, and then going to war to join this worst war in history would extinguish the possibility of global friendship, global harmony, global democracy, on which they thought the only possibility of moving beyond war depended. And in that, they agreed in many ways with Woodrow Wilson, which is the irony, perhaps. They met with Wilson quite often, actually, before war was declared, to plead with him to support them. And he often said, well, I basically do support you, but we have to increase the military a little bit anyway. He tried to have it both ways in many ways. The second argument was what you might call the populist, small p argument against going to war. That is the idea that war only benefits big business. Here's a particularly graphic example of that point of view. The radical cartoonist Art Young for the Masses magazine, radical magazine at the time, edited by Crystal Eastman's brother, Max Eastman, showing Uncle Sam fattened by the horrors of war, with a whip that says wage slavery. Not the most subtle cartoon in the world. But it made its point, obviously. So the idea here is that the pro-war movement, led by groups like the National Security League and the Army League and the Navy League, wanted war because they wanted to build up profits from munitions factories and steel factories and factories that were making various kinds of vehicles and even airplanes, and bullets and army clothing and everything else. It was a crude argument, and we can argue about whether they were accurate at all about it, but obviously it was a powerful one at a time when many Americans believed that big business had too much power. This was the progressive era, after all. It was an era when antitrust laws were being passed, when some laws to protect labor organizing were being passed, when the income tax itself, that amendment, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, was ratified. So there was a lot of people, a lot of Americans, whatever they thought about war, who were susceptible to this kind of argument. In some ways, I'll stop here and then just talk a little bit about what happened once the U.S. declared war. In some ways, the anti-war movement and coalition that I wrote about was, even though there were a lot of radicals in it, was in many ways a conservative cause. Because all of these figures, in many ways, wanted the United States to be able to continue along the same course it was going on until there was a possibility of war being declared. They believed, whether they're progressives or more conservative figures like Claude Kitchen, that U.S. didn't need to go to this war, and in fact, if the U.S. did go to war, the possibility of a better America, however they define that better America, would be destroyed. And one of the more pithy statements of that point of view, I think, was put forth in a speech opposing the declaration of war by the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, another Democrat, this guy, Senator William Stone from Missouri. I won't vote for this war because if we go into it, we will never again have the same old republic. Now, he was a Southern Democrat. In effect, Missouri might as well have been a Southern state at the time. What he meant by the same old republic wasn't exactly what Morris Hillquit would have meant, or Jane Addams, or Crystal Eastman, or even Robert La Follette. But they all agreed that going to war would produce what we would now call a national security state. And I would argue that it began that process of creating that state. As you know, there was no either large military or large intelligence apparatus in this country before World War I. Well, in the end, of course, the peace movement lost. It was defeated by the choices Wilson made that I mentioned before, and also by the Kaiser's, Wilhelm's choice, early in 1917, to respond to reverses on the battlefield by ordering his fleet of U-boats to sink any ship, whether or not it flew neutral colors, which were carrying supplies to his enemies, as American ships were. The president, who had staked the nation's honor and prosperity on protecting freedom of the seas, felt he had no choice but to go to war. He also had decided, Wilson had, that if the U.S. did not go to war, then the U.S. could not have a hand in deciding the shape of the peace. He wanted very badly a League of Nations, a Federation of Nations, and he felt he couldn't get that unless the U.S. took part in winning the war, because why would the victorious powers listen to this still neutral nation? But after declaring war, Wilson betrayed, you might say, his friendship with the anti-war members of the anti-war coalition and urged Congress to pass two of the most repressive laws in American history, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which are actually amendments to the Espionage Act, which in effect made it illegal, at least potentially illegal, to speak out against the war, to oppose the draft, which was started after the U.S. war was declared as well. The progressive writer Randolph Bourne famously said in an essay opposing the war, he said, war is the health of the state. And certainly the federal government powers grew far beyond what they'd been before because of World War I. So what did those who opposed the war do? Well, some of them kept opposing the war and went to jail for it, like the great anarchist leader Emma Goldman, who started a group called the No Conscription League and was put in jail for speaking out against the draft and trying to organize young men not to obey the draft. Others kept opposing the war, but doing it in a more subtle way, you might say, by supporting the cases of those who were being arrested for opposing the war. Conscientious objectors who were not able to qualify as conscientious objectors because they were not part of peace churches like the Mennonites and the Quakers, and many others as well. The major group which was behind the defense of anti-war prisoners was a group then called the National Civil Liberties Bureau. Name might sound familiar. 1920, the NCLB changed its name to the ACLU. Also, for the first time, African-American activists got involved in the anti-war cause. Two of the leaders were A. Philip Randolph, seen as a young man there, not as the great civil rights leader who proposed the March on Washington in 1963. He was then an active socialist, and he spoke out against the war. And Ida Wells Barnett, the great anti-lynching activist, who also spoke out against the war. And I can talk more about all this activism if you like during the question period. Actually, Randolph spent a lot of time in the fall of 1917 campaigning for Hillquit for mayor of New York. And Hillquit got a higher percentage of the vote in Harlem, which was becoming the capital of Negro America, we would call it at the time, or Black America as we say today, than he did elsewhere in the city. There was also a very large opposition to the draft. I want to talk about that just for a minute. Now, many textbooks about World War give you the idea that the draft was overwhelmingly popular, that 10 million young men registered for the draft without very much difficulty. They were gung-ho for the war, and this shows supposedly how much support there was for the war. They often don't tell you that 10 million men registered, but 3 million men who were supposed to register never did, never bothered to register at all. About 350,000 those who did register resisted in one way or another, either by not reporting to their military camps as they were told to, or deserting from their training camps. Black Americans who suffered under Jim Crow laws were particularly unhappy about risking their lives in a war for democracy proclaimed by President Woodrow Wilson, who promoted segregation in the federal government. And there were also a lot of white men in the South, especially rural areas, who didn't want to fight in what many called a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And taken together, a higher percentage of American men decided to resist conscription during the Great War than during the Vietnam conflict, half a century later, where the anti-war, anti-draft movement is much better known. A graphic by the painter, artist George Bellows, showing a conscientious objector in jail, of course, comparing him to Christ. Well, finally, what was the results of the war? Very quickly. First of all, the United States won, not just militarily, but economically. The United States, unlike European nations whose economies were destroyed in many ways because of the war, the United States economy was booming as opposed to the war, during the war, and only took a slight recession after the war was over. And the United States became, as a result of the war, the most prosperous nation in the world. In effect, the capital of the 20th century. But Wilson's great hopes that there would be a peace without victory, that there would be a very effective World Federation of Nations, a League of Nations, that there would be self-determination for nations within empires, that the harmonious, peaceful, democratic world that the peace movement wanted to would come to pass. Well, we know that didn't happen. What happened, of course, 20 years later was a much worse, much greater war. World War I killed about 17 million people. World War II killed 50 million people. Wilson went to Paris in 1919 as a great hero because of his great idealistic purposes that he spoke for, but the peace treaty he signed in Paris was not ratified by the Senate. He had a stroke in Colorado as he was speaking for ratification of the peace treaty, and as many of you probably know, he was an invalid for the rest of his term in office, even though most Americans didn't know that. So the terrible irony, to conclude, I hate to conclude on a sad note, but is that the United States' choice to intervene in World War I may have made the next war, World War II, a far bloodier global conflict, more likely. The historian John Coogan puts it this way: it was the genius of Woodrow Wilson which recognized that a lasting peace must be a peace without victory. It was the tragedy of Woodrow Wilson that his own unneutrality would be a major factor in bringing about the decisive Allied victory that made a healing peace impossible. Thank you. So I'm curious to hear what you think about, what I said about the war, about whatever. Yes, sir.
Would you speculate as to what might have happened had the Germans not sunk any of the U.S. ships?
Yeah.
Was that the key point, or would it have happened anyway?
Yeah, well, that was actually key. I mean, clearly. The only casus belli, the only cause of war that Wilson could claim was the fact that American ships were being sunk. Neutral ships were being sunk by a belligerent power. I mean, that was against international law, clearly, even though the United States was carrying materiel. I'm not a lawyer, maybe some people in the room are, but at the time it was completely illegal for a neutral country and the ships of a neutral country to ship war material to one side or both sides, for that matter. And of course, I mentioned, the U.S. did that from early 1915 on until 2 years later when the U.S. declares war, and continues to do that. But it was not legal for a government to shoot down those ships. So Wilson could claim that he was obeying the law, and also Americans were being killed. The first famous example of that, of course, was the Lusitania, torpedoed in April 1915, May 1915, with 120-something Americans on board who died. Oh, more on board, but only 120-something died. But the U.S. did not go to war then. It doesn't go to war until 2 years later. But once the Germans decide in February 1917 to resume unrestricted U-boat warfare, they had been abiding by a complicated arrangement for about a year before then, called the Sussex, based on the Sussex Pledge, based on a ship which had been sunk in 1916. And they go back on that pledge, and it's only then that it becomes, I think, pretty inevitable that the United States would go to war. What would happen if they hadn't done that? It's a good question, It would have been harder to get Americans on the side of the war. It would have been harder to get large majorities in Congress to support the war. I'm not sure whether Wilson would have asked for a declaration. And then we have to go towards the greater counterfactual, as historians call it. What if the Germans won? And that's, of course, historians aren't supposed to ask those questions. We're supposed to figure out why what happened happened, not what would have happened if what happened happened, if what happened didn't happen. I've done some of that. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of War, April 6th, which did speculate, what would have happened if the U.S. hadn't entered the war and the Germans had won. I'll do a little of it here, though, you might, if you're a historian in the crowd, you might not like it. I think it's quite possible that the Germans win, they dominate Europe, but they don't dominate Europe the way Hitler did or tried to. They dominate Europe with a government which is semi-democratic. The Germans had an elected government, elected parliament, the Reichstag, the largest party of which was actually a socialist party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Would that have remained that way? Who knows afterwards? So it wouldn't have been a good outcome, obviously. You still would have had a Bolshevik government in Russia. There still would have been a lot of tension between the Bolsheviks and the Germans. But it's unlikely you would have had the rise of the National Socialist movement, which was led, as most of you know, by disgruntled German soldiers like Hitler, who had been a soldier in World War I, had been wounded in World War I, whose main grievance when they formed the party was, we were stabbed in the back by Jews and socialists. We could have kept fighting, but they made us give up. So it's possible, though we'll never know for sure, if the U.S. doesn't enter World War I, the Germans win, and we don't get World War II. Again, Saturday Night Live used to have an old routine, 20 years ago or so. What if Eleanor Roosevelt could fly? So asking these questions is kind of a what if Eleanor Roosevelt could fly question. So, but it's worth speculating about. And other historians have done this too, of course. Yes, sir.
If you could go back for a moment to the origins of the peace movement.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether the peace movement grew primarily out of the conflict in Europe at that time in 1914, or whether the origins of the American peace movement could be traced back earlier to the Spanish-American War and to our acquisition of territories and so forth.
That's a great question. I addressed that in the first chapter of my book, of course, the prologue of the book, actually. Because, there had been a peace movement in America earlier. I mentioned William Lloyd Garrison. I mean, there was this non-resistance movement before the Civil War. There was a important but I think limited movement called the Anti-Imperialist League, which opposed the taking of the Philippines. So William Jennings Bryan, when he ran for president second time, 1900, in effect was endorsed by the Anti-Imperialist League because he was opposed to U.S. conquest of the Philippines. And there was a more elite movement from the late 1880s, which I talk about, involving international lawyers, involving college professors, involving people from the peace churches, which were trying to work out some grand mediation arrangement where all wars would be mediated in one way or another by some international tribunals. And having peace conferences in The Hague, for example, that started in 1899. That was our first peace conference in The Hague. And included, at one point, at this peace conference, I think it was the one in 1907, the Tsar of Russia, the King of England, all these crowned heads would come to show how much support they had for this idea. And so there was I think not a huge, but a sort of top-heavy, more elite peace movement, which included Andrew Carnegie, for example. The Carnegie Endowment for Peace, which is a big building in D.C., began in 1910. Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest Americans in the world, endowed it with $10 million of his own money, which was equal to about $200 to $300 million today. And he was very much in favor of these one kind of proposal or another to bring about a more peaceful world. Of course, this movement got disrupted and divided when when Europe goes to war, because a lot of those people had supported were pro-British, and they could not stand on the sidelines and saying the British are wrong when the British go support the war. Andrew Carnegie was from Scotland, as you probably know, and he was distraught when U.S. goes to war, when Britain goes to war, but he can't really oppose it. So it's really only in 1914 when the anti-war movement becomes a mass movement, I think, as I discussed. Before then, it was more or less not exactly professional activists. That's a little unfair. There were people who devoted themselves to it. Jane Addams wrote a book called New Ideals of Peace in 1906, where she floated ideas of how to bring about a more peaceful world. But it was mostly male. It was mostly very well-to-do, well-educated people who were part of it, trying to work out these complicated plans for international mediation. Other questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Given the tremendous exports of food to Europe, where did the farm economy and the agricultural community
It was doing great. It was booming.
But what was the sentiment?
Well, it was complicated. I mean, it depended on who you were, it depended on what your politics were, of course. There was a group called the Nonpartisan League, you might have heard of, which was a fairly radical movement. It began in North Dakota. It spread to Wisconsin and Minnesota, Montana, other farming states. It had opposed going to war, it opposed preparedness. And in 1917, they had a huge convention in St. Paul, Minnesota, and they invited La Follette to speak. And La Follette gave a speech where he basically said, we shouldn't have gone to war. And he was almost expelled from the Senate for saying that. And this was a group of farmers. These were small farmers, almost entirely part of that. At the same time, farmers who didn't have a strong opinion about the war, when they saw the price of corn and wheat, almost doubling, they were not unhappy, obviously. Ironically, in the 1920s, which was a prosperous period in America as a whole, was a period of recession in the farm, because a lot of people put all this acreage into cultivation, and then the market wasn't as big as it had been during the war. In part because immigration was actually limited. That's another story. So it was a real mix. I think farmers were not just farmers, of course. They were Republicans, socialists, some Democrats, etc. So it really depended on where you're from and what your allegiances were, I think, going into the war. Now, it's certainly true that there were some farmers were best described as isolationists. They thought, hey, here I am in Iowa. I'm not going to be touched by this war. That's certainly true. But we often forget, too, America was a very immigrant nation back then 100 years ago. Still is today, too. I won't make any comments about the president's recent comment about that. But, I think people came from all parts of the world, as they do now, but more from Europe than elsewhere. And, of course, farmers were German American, Norwegian American, Irish American, British American. Some came from Canada and so forth, and northern New England. Some were from Quebec. So that had a lot to do, I think, with how they felt about the war as well. There were whole farming communities in Texas where German was the first language, for example, and Germans were, I didn't have time to go into it, Germans were of course, repressed during the war. They weren't put into jail just as Germans unless they did something about it, but they were, of course, under suspicion in a way that, say, Canadians were not. So that had, something to do with it as well, is what your ethnic background were, what your politics was before then. So there was no sort of all farmers or most farmers thought one way or the other. And of course, remember, most Americans until 1920 lived in rural areas. World War I accelerated the move to the cities, and the census for the first time in 1920 said a majority of Americans for the first time in American history live in urban areas, which only meant places 2,500 people or more, not very big. But a lot of people who came from the farms, went to the army, did not go back to the farms. They went to the cities. So anyway, that's a long answer to your good question. Any other questions? World War I expert.
Question about Wilson. So he's reelected in November 1916 on a peace platform. He campaigns on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And less than 5 months later, first week of April, he goes to Congress to ask for a declaration of war.
Second, actually.
April 2nd, right? Yeah. First week, yeah.
April Fool's Day, it wasn't.
It was the first week, April.
Yeah.
And in between, of course, is the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and then also the publication of the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany proposes an alliance against the United States with Mexico and return to Mexico of territory in the Southwest. So does Wilson come to the war position through his own reasoning? Is he carried along by congressional opinion? Is he carried along by a shift in public opinion? What shapes his thinking in between November and April?
Yeah. Well, not surprisingly, historians disagree. As I said before, I think he was more inclined to want to go to war if he couldn't mediate a peace. Now, after he was elected in November 1916, there's a fascinating period of about a month where he puts out peace feelers to the belligerent powers. It says basically, "I'm willing to mediate. What are your peace? Give me your conditions for bringing about peace." And the Germans give him some conditions. The British talk about giving conditions, don't really. The conditions are completely, impossible on both sides. Each side says, "Well, give us what we want, and we'll give up. We'll win." Basically, if you give us victory, we won't keep fighting for it. And then, but as late as January 22nd, 1917, he gives this amazing speech, which I'm sure you know, called the Peace Without Victory speech, where he stands in front of a joint session of Congress and says, "We want a peace without victory. We think all sides should figure out ways to come together, and I will, in effect, help them to do this." He didn't know that 2 weeks before, the Kaiser had agreed to resuming unrestricted U-boat warfare, which actually begins February 1st, 1917. I think after that point, he'd like to find some way, short of war, to force the Germans to stop. He supports something called armed neutrality, which is putting naval gunners on passenger ships to shoot U-boats if they can. La Follette actually leads a filibuster against this bill in Congress, and it fails as the congressional session ends March 3rd, 1917. And then a couple weeks later, by executive order, Wilson puts armed neutrality into effect. But I think my friend John Milton Cooper Jr., who's I think the best biographer of Wilson, points out, I think by early February he thought it was unlikely U.S. could sort of stand by and while the Germans torpedoed American ships. It wasn't going to go over big with the public if that happened. At least not most of the public, and not most of Congress either. So it's not until I think it's a cabinet meeting on March 21st, 1917. I can check my book, where he actually asks the cabinet to tell him what he thought. Should I ask for a declaration of war? And every single one says yes. Now, some historians say, well, he wasn't sure at that point, or others say he wanted to make sure they were with him. He wouldn't have any divisions. Because there were cabinet members, like the Navy Secretary at the time, Josephus Daniels from North Carolina, good friends with Bryan, who was still opposed to going to war, good friends with Keaton, who was still, of course, opposed to going to war, who voted against going to war, as I mentioned a couple weeks later, who didn't want to go to war. So, but he wanted them behind him, and they all the cabinet, some reluctantly agreed. Only at that point, officially, he's for going to war. So, in other words, it's complicated. There's no Pearl Harbor, there's no point at which U.S. is neutral, though it's sending goods to the Allies as we were in 1940-41, well, not very much, actually. The Neutrality Act's more complicated. But it was a gradual process, I think. The Zimmerman telegram actually had little to do with it, I think, actually. I thought going into this research, like most people, that, the Zimmerman telegram, the German foreign secretary basically says to the Mexicans, if you attack the United States, we'll help you get Texas back, and Utah, and New Mexico, and Arizona, maybe even California. But I did research on this, most of the newspapers said, this is crazy, this is never going to happen. And of course, he's not saying do it now, he's saying if we go to war. But they thought this foreign secretary must be out of his mind. Mexico's still involved in a civil war, in effect. The possibility of Mexico successfully invading the United States was just lunacy. And most newspapers and politicians understood that. So yeah, it was big headlines, but the headlines faded by the time the U.S. actually does declare war. One final question, or not? I can sign books if you feel like buying one. Anyway, thanks very much.